I am fully in my long form content era, and I feel like every business should be creating long form content. And so I want to share the exact strategy that I have been using and am really leaning in on. I want to do a case study style and show you the results that I've seen so far, my whole workflow, and how I approach my long form content and some tips that you can hopefully seal for yourself if I convince you to go all in with long form content. And if you love this episode, I know you are going to love the workshop that I'm going to be hosting all about this. In the workshop, you are going to be learning this strategy in depth. This is really just a teaser and just to scratch the surface. So if you're interested in learning more about the ultimate podcast and YouTube strategy and this workshop with a live Q&A, a guide, a toolkit, so many goodies. Definitely check it out in the description. So I first want to get clear on what long form content means to me. So essentially long form content means a podcast, but also YouTube content. So that is what long form content, and I like to bundle them together, which you'll see why once I get deeper into the strategy. And I first want to get some context out of the way on how I even got to this point. So I've had my podcast for a few years, and a few years back, I also decided to start a YouTube channel. Initially, I was doing every other week podcast episodes, and then for my YouTube channel, I was aiming for 1 to 2 episodes a week. But keeping in mind, these pieces of content were completely different, completely separate. And initially, I thought, oh, if I cross posted, this would make me so lazy. People wouldn't want to watch or listen if they knew it was on another platform. So I honestly took pride in the fact that they were very separate platforms with completely different types of content. That leads me to when I was accepted into the HubSpot Creators Program. And so during that program, I had less than 6 months to hit 10,000 monthly downloads. And if you're not familiar with the podcasting world, this is a really big milestone that only 1% of podcasts even hit. And so that really led me to think of what were all of my options. And a lot of podcasts grow with ads. There's a lot of different strategies, but ads is like one of the guaranteed ways. But of course, as an organic content girly, as a video girly, I was like, we're going to see if we can do this a different way. And so when I got accepted into the program, I very much was like, I'm going to fully focus on my podcast, which means YouTube might take a little bit of a step on the back burner. I had just done my full first year in YouTube and I had just hit the 1,000 subscriber mark. So my channel was still pretty small, but I was like, we're going to focus on podcasts because that's what the season I was in. And so one of the big things that I focused on when growing my podcast is I started turning podcast episodes into videos. And I also started getting really creative with how I took a podcast episode or even those video episodes I was publishing on YouTube and how I was turning those into promo content on my Instagram, for example, into reels. I also was testing things like doing series. So I've done a back to basics series and a sales school series, which I highly recommend binging. You guys have eat these up. They're so good. And once I started doing all of those things, I was able to hit that really big milestone of 10,000 monthly downloads. And that was one of the things that I feel like made the biggest impact. And so that's basically what I was focusing on all last year was a lot of those strategies that I mentioned. I've actually done an entire podcast episode on this if you want to hear as it was happening in the moment. But what was really interesting is that even though I really wasn't focusing on my YouTube channel at all, I actually was starting to see really great results from my YouTube channel. Keeping in mind, almost all of the content I posted last year on my new YouTube channel was video podcast episodes. And then I did a few vlogs here and there, which aren't really for growth for my channel specifically and my strategy. But I just thought it was so interesting how my channel was continuing to grow month after month. And some of those podcast episodes were taking off, but it also was triggering my other old content to really start to take off. And that's one of the really cool benefits of YouTube is it's a search and discovery platform. This is like the OG of TikTok. Like before TikTok was even doing this, YouTube has been doing this, right? And so this also includes people searching certain things within my industry and getting that content recommended, right? And so essentially, I was still able to stay on track to get 1,000 new subscribers by the end of that year. So I'm a little over 2,000 subscribers now, which, like I said, is still very much a small channel. I'm very close to hitting monetization, like within weeks, which is very exciting. And that was all from posting so inconsistently, not posting any organic to YouTube content. So content specifically for YouTube and no other platform, and from posting my video podcast episodes. And so even as I left the HubSpot Creator Program and network, and as I was starting from scratch, and I was like, what does this mean for my podcast? What does this mean for my YouTube strategy? I really was looking at all the data and the numbers, and I was like, oh, these platforms work so well together. And even more specifically, this year I went to Podcast Movement's Evolutions event. I was speaking at it. And I knew I wanted to go to the keynote that they were having from YouTube. And y'all, I have to share these stats and notes that I took because I think it is so interesting. So essentially, the podcast industry and YouTube itself are changing and molding and meshing. And these were some of the things that were really interesting. So YouTube is the first or second behind Spotify for podcast consumptions. So it is one of the top platforms that people are consuming podcasts. That was fascinating. YouTube is a search engine, right? So it's becoming a great way to discover new podcasts. When you think about podcasts outside of YouTube in the conversation, there are ways that you can grow it and get it discovered. And search is not usually one of them unless you're like putting your show notes as blog posts. But it's not like you go on to Apple and search a topic and it has a very intuitive, it doesn't mean it's not possible, but it doesn't mean it's a big part of how podcasts grow. And this one, fascinating. Consumers are embracing video podcasts with 40% of new listeners preferring video podcasts. I think it's so interesting. And the last is that podcasts are becoming the equivalent of watching a show in many living rooms. And so they really emphasized during this keynote that living room viewing is becoming the norm. So it seems like in the past, when I think of a podcast, it's something I listen to on my commute or in the gym or while I'm on the go, which I think is still a certain type of consumer. But what YouTube is sharing is that more and more people are actually just like putting it on their TVs in their living room, or they're watching while they're like, they watch it like it's a show. So maybe they're like actually sitting down and watching it, or they're passively watching it like a lot of us do. And so all that to say, I was like, wow, YouTube is really focusing on podcasts. The podcast industry is really changing where video is becoming almost a non-negotiable. So it almost seems silly to not integrate the two of them. And so that leads us to where we are today, which is where, when I think about my content platforms, Instagram, I have a very established audience. I know that I could be doing more, as always, innovating, trying new things, like all these types of things, but I'm not actively trying to grow my Instagram account, always trying to grow my email list. We love email. But really when I'm thinking about it, I'm like, oh, like these are the platforms I really want to be focusing on. And that's where I want to get into my case study. So not only was I able to grow my podcast to 10,000 monthly downloads, not only was I able to grow my YouTube channel to be over 2,000 subscribers, and now almost being able to hit monetization, but when I actually looked in my business, I saw that a lot of my clients said that my podcast and or my YouTube channel was actually where they were influenced to join one of my programs or to work with me. This also has become something that's coming up more and more in brand conversations and negotiations. More and more brands are interested in actually doing ads or brand partnerships on these channels, considering they're both still pretty small. And one that I think is probably the most consistent result that I've seen in general from starting to add in podcasting, but also now that there's a video element, is this is one of the top places that I'm getting recommended to get interviewed on people's podcasts, like big podcasts, how I'm getting paid speaking engagements. I could probably pull up so many emails where they're like, oh, I heard this series on your podcast, or oh, I love this episode you did on your podcast, or I love this video you posted on your YouTube channel. And I think it's because it's longer form, which this in general works on any platform. It's like really what I focus on in my mastermind is you need to be creating, speaking, thought leadership content if that's what you're wanting to attract. But I really think that long form leans into this because it is just a lot more robust. And so it's really just been an interesting shift for me of realizing, wow, these platforms have been like secondary to my main platforms, pretty small, yet driving so many results for my business. So this is why I am so excited about long form content. And so I want to break down my strategy and why implementing it into your own strategy might actually be a lot easier than you think. So when I think of it, I actually don't think of it as like my podcast strategy, my YouTube strategy. I think of them all under one umbrella now, which I think is something not a lot of people are doing. And keep in mind, I don't think of my YouTube channel as a podcast channel. That's definitely something you can do. You can have a branded to your podcast channel, and some people have it separate from their main channel. But I was like, that kind of seems silly, right? If someone is watching my YouTube videos, they would care just as much about my podcast as my non podcast content. And so that's why when I'm recording my video podcast episodes, when we're editing and putting on the final touches, you'll notice the titles are a little bit different for like my podcast versus YouTube. And of course, we're optimizing the thumbnail, which is a really big part of YouTube strategy. It's like a really big part of how your content is discovered and really people are clicking on your content. And so I really was focusing on those YouTube specific things. And when it comes to the edits of my content, I was making sure my video quality was high quality. I'm not using a really fancy camera. I'm not using really fancy lighting. Like it definitely could be better, but I wasn't just using a webcam, which I think is what a lot of people do when they're putting a podcast to YouTube. And I was adding edits that make sense for my industry that made my videos look and feel like they literally might as well been like a regular piece of content. And I think that's really allowed it to be a very seamless part of my YouTube strategy is like whether I was creating an organic to YouTube video or if I was posting a podcast, they look and feel the same, which is why they're starting to perform the same for me as well. So that's how I like to think of the content. And for me, I have more educational, strategy based content. And then I have things that are a little bit more chatty, a little bit more hot takes, that kind of thing. So that's like the main types of content that I would be sharing on not only my podcast and my YouTube channel. So like I said, it really just makes sense to have them on both platforms. And then from there, of course, I'm sharing with my email list, but I also am sharing on stories and I share both links on my stories. And then I also am posting it on Instagram as a reel. So I played around with a lot of different reel formats and most of them perform really well. I played around with DM automation for it. And so whether I'm taking a video from the actual video episode, or if I'm taking that topic and I'm turning it into something that feels and looks more like a reel, that's how I've been not only promoting that episode, but taking that long form content that already has so much goodness in it and actually turning it into a new piece of content. And there are so many benefits of long form content. The first is that it can actually feel a lot less restrictive than short form content. So if you struggle to be like, how can I put all of my ideas into a 90-second or even less video? Long form really allows you to go deep with your content. And that's why it leans so well into repurposing, which is one of the other benefits is you can completely change your content strategy. Of course, you can figure out where long form fits in, but it can be kind of a top-down approach is you can focus on all your energy on your longer form content. And then from there, you're pulling to your shorter form content. So it's actually going to require a lot less creating, a lot less reinventing the wheel. And it's really going to keep all of your messaging and your content very consistent, which I think initially before I was like, am I being lazy for doing that? Even if I'm being thoughtful with how I'm repurposing. But if anything, you're giving your people more opportunities to really allow that message to sink in. Also, like long form content is so much easier than you think. You don't need fancy edits. You don't need to be a pro at YouTube. You don't need to hire a team to even manage it. Like these are all myths that you do not even need to be bothering with when it comes to long form content. I've been discovering so many really great tools for using AI to not only edit your content, but to pull all of those final touches like promo content, description, things like that. And it honestly can be so much easier in terms of tech. You don't need really fancy mics, you don't need a really fancy camera. And honestly, just setting it up in itself, like the setup that I'm recording in right now, I literally would have thought would have been the most fancy, complicated thing ever. But it's really not. It really is just challenging yourself to try something new and experiment. And it's usually a lot easier than you think. And like the biggest benefit is this is literally BOGO. If you already have a YouTube channel, there's no reason why your content can't be a podcast. And if you already have a podcast, there is no reason why it shouldn't be video episodes on YouTube. And if you're starting from scratch and literally you're on neither platform, you can easily add 2 platforms with the effort of 1. And you're also getting that searchable element of YouTube, and you're able to cater towards different consumer preferences. Some people really prefer podcasts, some people prefer video episodes. And so you're able to really give people both options. And keeping in mind, while I think of them as the same strategy, you can post things still exclusively to each platform. Like I can still post a bonus podcast episode. I can still post something just for YouTube, especially if it doesn't make sense to be audio only. So you can definitely still do organic to each platform content. But for the core element, having them be on both just makes so much sense, and they will grow each other. Posting more on your YouTube channel will grow your YouTube channel. Posting your video episodes on YouTube will help grow your podcast. And getting tons of promo content you can use for Reels will grow both of them. And as I mentioned with my case study, it has really opened up new monetization opportunities. And I really think that once my channel is optimized, affiliate income, because you have the descriptions and there's that discoverability element. And I think that's what a lot of people think of, especially as a creator. That is like the typical way to make money. Honestly, brand partnerships, speaking, and it actually fueling my funnels, that's like where I'm thinking as I'm setting up my evergreen funnels is, can I share my free challenge? Can I share my workshop that I'm hosting? Can I share those things and use my long form content that has a little bit more longevity, especially on a platform like YouTube, to actually fill my funnels, but also just fill my offers in general? And to end things off, I really think that it works for so many niches and industries. The best way to see this in action is literally go onto YouTube and search something related to your industry, and you will probably see so many videos. And that is proof that not only you can be on YouTube and see success, but you can also post that content as a podcast. If you love this episode, I highly recommend checking out my long form content workshop. I'm going to be sharing a more in-depth breakdown of my workflow, my tools, how I approach these platforms, how I repurpose. Everything is in this workshop, including a guide and even a live Q&A during the workshop. So you definitely want to be there. I will leave all the details in the description. I'll see y'all in the next episode.